Hello and welcome to Dialogue. A leaked U.S. Supreme Court draft opinion reveals a potential decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, a landmark 1973 ruling supporting abortion rights in the U.S. 5 of the 9 justices support the decision, making a majority, and this has triggered widespread debates and protests in the U.S. Why the sudden shift of opinion? Who leaked the draft, and what are the consequences if the Supreme Court overturns the landmark decision? To find out, I'm joined by Sophia Yan, CEO and co-founder of Pandia Health, Ray Baker, adjunct professor at Towson University, and Zhao Miao, partner of CGTN Gongchen law firm. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show. I will start with Sophia. Sophia, tell us, what is at stake with the revolution that could, Roe v. Wade could be overturned?
If a Roe v. Wade were overturned, my understanding is that abortion would become illegal or severely restricted in 28 states. There are some trigger laws that, if Roe v. Wade were ever to be reversed instantly, would make it illegal in several states in the United States. It makes me horrified and sad that somebody that is in the same country as I am would have lesser rights, and that this Supreme Court would view that women and those of us with uterized bodies are not our bodies to decide, our bodies to control. One of the fundamentals of the American dream is freedom of religion. A lot of people came here to avoid persecution for Buddhism, Puritan, Catholicism, whatever their religion is. And by forcing this decision back to the states and reversing the right to abortion, the right to decide what happens to my body according to my religion in conjunction with my physician, the court is saying that women are second-class citizens, that if we are raped, then we will be forced to carry a pregnancy to term, that my rapist has more rights to force me to do something against my will, and that I am a second-class citizen. So it is just depressing and horrifying, and as I like to say, if you make abortion illegal or difficult to access, it doesn't make it go away. It only makes it dangerous, delayed, and more expensive. And so I am pro-choice or pro-abortion rights because I'm pro-life. If you make it difficult, women will hurt themselves and bad things will happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, horrifying. So Ray, tell us, it seems to me like this abortion issue is not only a legal issue, but a health issue, but also a rights issue and a political issue too, right?
Absolutely. It's a political issue in ways that the people who are supporting what they are calling pro-life movement unfortunately have a deep vein and a connection to people who have also been racist, people who have been sexist, people who are antagonistic to our LGBTQIA plus community. And we know that in 2019, for example, the vice president of an organization called the New Wave Feminists, a woman self-described as an ethno-nationalist. We know that Tim Ryan, I believe his name is, who's the president of the Aryan Nation in the United States, is a community of white supremacists who said that he supports the anti-choice movement because this is a part of the holy war in support of the pure Aryan race. So many people in the pro-life movement are functionally out to espouse this white replacement theory, which quickly means the idea that there are white Americans who believe that so long as abortion is legal, so long as abortion and the opportunity or the access to abortion is widespread, then the white population will dwindle because white women will abort their children. In their efforts to promote white hegemony across the United States to maintain a degree of order of white supremacy and to relegate women's rights, to minimize the role and autonomy of women, to do 2 things at one time, this white nationalist community are finding themselves aligned with and in support of the anti-choice movement, what otherwise called the pro-life movement. And so what we're seeing is that it's an opportunity for those people who support this kind of legislation, who support anti-abortion measures, to try to achieve multiple aims through one particular stream right now. And so what I would advise those outside of the United States to pay attention to, subsequently to impact to restrict voting access to African Americans, to Latino Americans, to Asian Americans, to older Americans, youthful Americans, and poor Americans. In conjunction with that, we see this attack on women's body autonomy. So also be on the lookout to see an attack through our judicial system on the rights of LGBTQIA folks, because these types of attacks do not tend to only isolate one group. They are continuously against those who have been historically marginalized and oppressed in the United States.
Well, it's also like a race issue, a bit of surprise. U.S. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren said that the Republican Party has been making this plot for decades. So Sophia, tell us, what does she mean by saying that?
As soon as Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, the other side started mobilizing to take over the state governments as well as many offices as possible. And although women have the right to abortion, whether or not they can access it is quite a different thing. And they've been taking away the right slowly, attacking it with different restrictions, a 24-hour waiting period, a vaginal ultrasound, things that are not, as a doctor I can say, medically indicated or necessary or healthy, or it just adds to the cost and it adds a barrier to women, making them come back for 2 visits, making it have to be the same person that counsels you that performs the procedures. They have trap laws, which are targeted restrictions against abortion providers, making sure that their doors have to be so wide, even though it's one of the most common procedures in the United States, and that you could, potentially do it yourself. Back in the day, women were doing it, and women are doing it in third world countries themselves. So you don't need these restrictions. It's simply barriers that they're putting up. So they have been working on this since 1973, and they've been working on taking over Secretary of State, who handles who can vote and who can not vote, because if you restrict the Democrats from voting, then the values of the Democrats are suppressed. However, this should not be a bipolitical party. This should just be whether you respect those of us with uteruses to have the right to determine what happens to my body. If I am raped or my daughter is raped, we should have the right to decide what happens, and we should not be a forced incubator for the government for 9 months.
Well, Ray, Sophia has made a good point here. It's really about the freedom, the human rights, or the issue of the women and her doctor probably, to decide what will happen, what's next for their own business, personal business. But then, the question is why is this happening now? We know that this U.S. politics has been very controversial, after 4 years of Trump. Does that have something to do with his ruling probably?
Oh, it probably has a lot to do. Quickly, I want to apologize to Ohio Senate candidate Tim Ryan. The head of the Aryan Nation in the United States is Tim Bishop. Excuse me, I wanted to clear that up. That was something I mentioned earlier. To your question about why is the Republican Party, why is the political landscape trying to effort at this right now? It's because, and Malika Jabali, the Essence political editor at a magazine here in the United States, she notes this eloquently when she says, the GOP as a party does not and has not offered anything regarding policy that meets the material needs of the vast majority of Americans, no matter what their political leanings are. And so the only way that they are able to galvanize a base and to rally and organize anyone to vote for them without being able to deliver anything meaningfully to people's lives is to develop these cultural issues along lines that people hold deeply and valuably to themselves. Many Americans who see themselves as legitimately perhaps religious or deeply informed in their politics by their religion are believing and acquiescing to politics and policy from people who do not share or hold the meaningful values or do not believe seriously what it is they're having this conversation about. So your question was about President Trump specifically, and my answer is yes. And if we look before American President Trump, we can look at the GOP President George W. Bush, who also was not able to deliver anything materially of substance that improved upon the lives of Americans. And time and again, what we see from our GOP party here in the United States, Again, for those outside of the United States, GOP is also the Republican Party because they are not able to deliver anything that is of material benefit to the food, clothing, shelter, and health and humanity, to the welfare of the mass of Americans. No one will vote for them on policy alone. So long as they stroke and stoke the racist inclinations of those who want a white supremacist country, so long as they attend to and invoke the interest of those who are anti-feminine autonomy, so long as they attack and engage those who are antagonistic to our queer and lesbian brothers and sisters, so long as they appeal to those people, then they think they have an opportunity to win elections. We also see, as your guest previously said, they are reducing the populace who can participate in elections because, again, their policies don't deliver anything for real Americans. So since they can't win by policies, they go to culture wars. And when they can't win along culture wars, because in the United States, more than half of the country polled, whenever they are polled, support abortion in almost all cases, because they can't even win on culture wars, then they reduce the number of people who can participate in elections. And that's the game they play because they don't offer anything meaningfully or substantial to the masses of Americans.
So it's like a politicization of an issue, the abortion issue here. Well, Bill Gates says, Roe v. Wade reversal would set us, quote, back 50 years and disproportionately impact the most vulnerable women in society. John Mill, you are a lawyer, so I wonder, should it be a simple issue of like rights? It belongs to women and the doctor and the family instead of the state or the Supreme Court. Should it become a legal issue at all in the first place?
This is a difficult question for me to answer. I mean, from my own perspective, it should never be, but somehow, probably because this abortion issue is very deeply related to both religious issues as well as political issues. So that's probably why it got into, the legal world. And then, since Donald Trump got the chance to nominate 3 justices to the benches, over his term, and then now the Supreme Court actually, it's easier for the conservative justices to actually pass whatever the party actually prefers. I mean, instead of the independence of justices, I mean, it seems very obvious that the legal systems now has an integrity challenge and independence challenge.
So Baker, I will go back to you here. As you said, if you take a look at the recent opinion poll, 70% of Americans believe this is an issue should be left to women and their doctor to decide. But I wonder, whether this kind of a public opinion, this popularity will have any effects on the possible ruling by the Supreme Court.
An interesting thing to note about that ruling, of the 5 justices who are leaked to have said supported the ignore and overturn Roe versus Wade, 4 of them were appointed by presidents who did not even win the popular election in the United States, including 3 from President Donald Trump and 1 from President George W. Bush. Time and again, we are seeing in the United States the by and large will of the masses are not being attended to or addressed in meaningful ways. And in fact, it speaks to the continuing devolution of the institutions in the United States. There are those within the United States who are ignoring the will of the masses, ignoring the will of the people, and coincidentally, this is happening at a time where we are now expanding and more people, more diverse communities have access and opportunity to have their voices being heard. And yet we're seeing time and again ways to undermine the will of the large mass of people. Yet none of this is really addressing and speaking to the material welfare, health, and safety and security of so many Americans. And so we're seeing that often these things are being divided along the lines of culture, along race, and ironically, the division is stoked by those who complain that identity politics are at the reason that the United States is often so divided.
Well, Sophia, one of the argument of those people who are against abortion would say, there's a fetus, abortion is like a killing children. This is, abortion equals a massacre even. How do you think about their argument as, someone in the medical field? I mean, is this like really like a damage of life, a killing of lives?
I think that it is a potential life because, as you know, there are many spontaneous abortions, aka miscarriages, that happen even before somebody knows they're pregnant or oftentimes in the first trimester. So in terms of life, when does it begin? When is this a full human being? That is a religious question. And in the Jewish community, they believe that if a woman's life is at stake, that this pregnancy is risking danger to her health or that she might die from the complications of it, that it is, according to her religion, she must terminate the pregnancy because they value more the person that's here and they can make more babies in the future than this potential life. And if you look back, in religious scripture in the United States as well, some say that life doesn't begin until you have a first breath. And you don't have lungs and you can't breathe until you can get out of the womb. So that would be your first breath. Or if you want to get technical, when do the lungs happen? The horrific thing is that Roe v. Wade, the good thing was that Roe v. Wade allowed termination up to viability, which is about 22 weeks. But many of these states, they're completely outlawing it, or they're moving it back to 15 weeks. And as a physician, I can tell you that sometimes fetal abnormalities show up. And so if you have a fetal abnormality and you're going to grow this for 9 or even 10 months because it's an abnormal pregnancy, and then it comes out and it immediately dies, is it worth it putting that woman through that pregnancy throughout that 9 or 10 months? Everybody comes up to you, oh, when's your baby due? And what's the name? And you're like, it's going to be born on this day and it's going to die within 48 hours. To put you through that agony. And also birthing an abnormal thing can also result in rupture of the uterus. So if you want to have future babies, that can be at risk too. It is really disgusting and callous that they are not making any exception for rape, incest, health, life of the woman. And it should be a private decision between a physician, a woman, her God, her religion, because this is America and we are about freedom of religion. Your uterus, your religion, your decision. My uterus, my religion, my decision.
I mean, also, well said. Even if you speak of freedom, you have a freedom of not practicing somebody else's religion, right? You can follow your own practice. Ray, obviously, yes, there are different religions. You have different religions, different practices. I wonder, whether some particular religion would like to impose their idea on people from other parts of practices or other minority groups, for example. I mean, Catholics, for example, of course, they have their own practice. Christians, Jewish people, and Buddhists. But what kind of a role should religion play, or how big a role should religion play in this debate?
Well, that's going to be difficult because, as the guest previously said, that each person should bring their own religion and their own values to the core of the issue. Now, what we can do is each individual will make the decisions that are important to them, whether it's voting, what decisions or politicians they would like to support, based on what their religion informs of them. However, it's important to note for the viewers, both those who may be watching in the United States and outside of the United States, the anti-abortion movement formally organized and began to make noise in the 1820s. And again, among that community of folks were those in the religious community who were adamant and loud and advocates for protecting the sanctity of life. And I'm grateful that we have a doctor on the panel with us who can remind us about the question of life and the determination of life being one that is still contested. I am not interested in offering a suggestion or a right answer as to when life begins, but to your point or to your question about the nature of religion's role in our public life, we cannot make public policy that will affect us all by the religious impulses governed by some. What we mean by that is not to denigrate or minimize the religious influence that happens on individuals and the ways that that guides their decision making. It should guide their decision making. However, we cannot use religion that is not something that is collectively agreed upon by the mass of our society to govern our mass of our society. I would also point out in the 1820s that there were religious communities that were fervently anti-abortion, yet there were some of the same religious communities, particularly the organized Christian church in the United States, that was pro-slavery. The organized Christian church that was anti-women voting. The organized Christian church that was anti-gay and lesbian people. So it's valuable to identify not just what religious values are, but how consistent are these practitioners of religious values, because that, what we see in the United States at least, is a deep inconsistency that makes this morality question, or morality principle, not stand up as strongly or as loudly as the advocates for it would like to think that it does.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me like there are like 13 states. They say there is a trigger ban. You know, they are waiting for this ruling from the Supreme Court, and then they can practice the ban. You know, there's no abortion in this particular state. Or how many of them, and what kind of impact they will have, you know, nationwide.
Yes, and if the Supreme Court ruling holds as we believe that it will, each state will then be allowed to have abortion laws that it sets forth. That's one of the reasons that the case is before the Supreme Court now, because Texas and Mississippi both implemented functionally laws that would overturn Roe versus Wade. What's interesting about this, and this is why we make the connection to those who may be sexist, racist, queer antagonistic, and things of the sort. In the United States, there's a term called states' rights. In fact, the Civil War in 1861 was fought over the question of states' rights, but when we dig deeper on the question of states' rights, it was the states' right to enslave people of African descent. So what we're now seeing with this overturning of Roe versus Wade and the anti-abortion and anti-choice efforts is again the same language of states' rights. Justice Samuel Alito alluded to sending this back to the states and the state legislatures to decide. But every time the United States has had a meaningful question about states' rights, it is ultimately served to ensure and enshrine white, supremacist, heterosexual, patriarchal harm and violence against everyone who is not white, heterosexual, male, and capitalist. And so ultimately we as Americans, we as members of the human community, have to ask meaningful questions as to what folks mean by state rights, what they want by state rights, because it cannot simply be for the state to decide, because every prominent advocate for state rights in very meaningful and national questions has meant state rights in ways that reinforces and reaffirms existing oppressions. Lastly, the American scholar Patricia Hill Collins talks about the matrix of domination. This is the confluence and interlocking oppressions of racism, sexism, and classism that is uniquely affecting black women, but as we can see by this, will reach its tentacles out to almost all disadvantaged women. And so if we ignore the question of state rights and the oppressive harm that it has, particularly on these oppressed groups that face this interlocking oppression, which we often talk about regarding intersectionality, if we ignore what states' rights means to those people, then those of us who feel like we are not threatened will soon be threatened, consumed by this idea of states' rights.
Well said. Sophia, obviously, you know, like if you assume people would say, oh, this is a ruling from the Supreme Court and this is only about abortion rights, but then there is a concern that if there are 5 justices who endorse the draft out of 9, will they stop with Roe v. Wade? What about the rights? What about the rights of those from the minority groups? For example, like gay marriage rights.
Yes, I think that what's really scary is, and I'm not a lawyer, but in the writing, it alluded that there is no right to privacy. So what you do in your bedroom sexually, but also what scared me is that they're coming for abortion, but now they're coming for birth control. And if you're really anti-abortion, you should pay and fund for comprehensive sex ed and birth control. But the states that are most restrictive on abortion are the states that are least likely to have comprehensive sex ed, least likely to support pregnant women when they give birth, single mothers, new babies, and the liberal states that allow abortion are the ones most likely to support a woman if she decides to continue that pregnancy. So what is scary is this is a slippery slope. This is the beginning of badness, as Ray has mentioned, that these people not only are anti-women, anti-abortion, but next comes birth control, next comes emergency contraception, next comes voting rights, next comes minority rights. And as a minority in this country, we've seen the hate that's been spread against us because of COVID and because of Trump accusing Asians of bringing COVID into this country and spreading it, when in fact it's his horrible public health policies and him making it a political issue when it absolutely should have been a public health issue. So we as a public need to stand up and say this Supreme Court is out of touch. And one of the things we can ask for is that the government balance the Supreme Court. The Democrats have sufficient numbers to add members to this radically skewed Supreme Court to balance it to reflect the will of the people. Because exactly as you've stated, 70% of this country supports that abortion is a personal decision for a woman to decide what happens to her body in conjunction with her doctor, her religion. But the Supreme Court is voting otherwise and making women second-class citizens. Start with women, next will come minorities, next will be everyone else.
Mm-hmm. We'll raise a very brief issue, brief answer probably, since we have a few seconds left. What kind of impact will it be on the upcoming midterm election? Will the progressives will be fired up, or the conservative pace be fired up, for example? So Democrats, Republicans, which side will benefit from such an controversial issue?
Well, I would want to say that you would think Democrats would, because this would fire up the base. But again, as Sophia alluded to, voting rights have been under attack in the United States as well. And so if the only option to defeat horrible judicial policy like the overturning of Roe v. Wade is to vote, yet my vote is being taken away from me, what recourse then do I have to address the horrible judicial decision of overturning Roe v. Wade? And so what it seems like might happen is that this might empower and embolden those conservative voters who would support the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because those folks are less likely to face hardships, voter suppression, intimidation, discrimination, and inability to access the vote easily, whereas those who might support wanting and maintaining Roe v. Wade would face all those challenges and difficulties of actually voting. So thus, if they don't vote or cannot vote, we cannot elect the necessary people who would ensure that we would have the types of justice and judicial makeup that would ensure justice. What a tangled web we weave.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. And you can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Xinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.